The shrill sound of panic shattered the polished calm of the executive boardroom. "Call an ambulance. Now she's not breathing." The voice belonged to Samuel Reed, a janitor who had been quietly working the perimeter just moments before. His mop clattered to the marble floor as he rushed forward, ignoring the collective gasp that rippled through the room. Only minutes earlier, Victoria Langford, the billionaire CEO of Langford Enterprises, had been standing confidently at the head of the long glass table, her presence commanding, her voice steady as she reviewed quarterly projections. Then, without warning, her words faltered. One hand flew to her chest, her face drained of color, and in the space of a heartbeat, she collapsed. At first, no one moved. The men and women seated around the table, all impeccably dressed and accustomed to control, seemed frozen in disbelief. Someone muttered that it had to be a joke. Another whispered for security. But the truth was undeniable. Victoria lay still on the floor, her lips darkening to a frightening shade of blue. She wasn't breathing. Panic surged through the room, but indecision ruled until Samuel pushed through the crowd. "What are you doing?" Someone snapped sharply. "You don't belong in here." Another voice followed, harsher, telling him to get out. Samuel ignored them all. He dropped to his knees beside Victoria, his heart pounding as he checked her pulse. Nothing. His chest tightened, but his body moved on instinct. Years ago, he had taken a free CPR class at a community center, never imagining it would matter like this. The instructor's words echoed in his mind. "If they're not breathing, you breathe for them." He tilted her head back, pinched her nose, and leaned down. A horrified cry erupted from across the table, someone accusing him of something obscene. Pain exploded across his back as a heavy object struck him, but he didn't stop. He delivered 2 breaths, then began compressions, counting aloud through clenched teeth. Another blow landed, then another, voices around him hissing insults, calling him filthy, demanding he stop touching her. Samuel's arms burned, his back screamed, but he stayed focused, pressing down again and again, refusing to let go. Then suddenly, Victoria's body jerked. She coughed, drawing in air like someone surfacing from deep water. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused but alive. Samuel sagged back, trembling, barely aware of the room erupting into frantic motion. Executives crowded around her, shouting her name as paramedics burst through the doors and took over. Someone asked who had started CPR. "I did," Samuel said quietly, his voice raw before he could say anything else. A tall man with silver hair stepped forward, his expression twisted with disdain. His badge read Oliver Grant, Chief Financial Officer. "What's your name?" he demanded. Samuel straightened. "Samuel Reed. I'm part of the cleaning staff." Grant sneered, accusing him of contaminating the CEO, of crossing a line. Samuel tried to explain. She wasn't breathing, but Grant cut him off. Ordering him to leave and warning that the footage would be reviewed, Samuel gathered his things with shaking hands and left the boardroom without a single word of thanks. Each step felt heavier than the last. He didn't know it then, but the moment he walked out, the course of his life quietly shifted. That night, the city swallowed him whole. He rode the bus home in silence, hunched in his seat as neon lights blurred past the window. By the time he reached his neighborhood, darkness had settled in. The sounds of distant trains and children playing echoed through the cold air. His daughter, Lily, ran to greet him, clutching her worn stuffed rabbit. She asked if he was okay. He lied gently, telling her it had just been a long day. Dinner was simple reheated pasta and leftover vegetables. Lily talked about school while Samuel nodded, his mind still trapped in that gleaming boardroom. Later, after their neighbor Mrs. Carter headed home, Samuel lay awake on the thin mattress, the ache in his back pulsing with every breath. He closed his eyes, but the image of Victoria lying motionless beneath his hands replayed endlessly. He had saved a life. Yet all anyone saw was a janitor who dared to touch a billionaire. The next morning, Samuel returned to the towering headquarters of Langford Enterprises, hoping for normalcy. The early sunlight painted the plaza in soft gold as he approached the revolving door. A security guard stopped him cold, saying he wasn't allowed inside. Confused, Samuel tried to explain, but the guard turned away, instructing him to contact human resources. A chill settled deep in Samuel's chest as office workers streamed past him like he didn't exist. Inside, after waiting beside the lockers where his name was still scrawled in marker, his supervisor handed him a sealed envelope. "You're terminated," the man said flatly. The reason listed was vague but damning. Inappropriate conduct involving senior personnel. No severance. No explanation. Samuel stood there long after the supervisor left, the word inappropriate echoing in his mind like a verdict. Outside, the city carried on without him. He walked until his legs gave out, collapsing onto a bus stop bench. His phone buzzed messages from coworkers, screenshots of a group chat. People were calling him a creep, accusing him of assault. Someone had shared a blurry still from the security footage, showing him leaning over Victoria. The truth had already been twisted into something ugly. At home, Lily noticed he was back early. He told her it was a misunderstanding. Mrs. Carter watched him carefully, concern etched into her face. That night, Samuel lay in the dark as messages continued to flood his phone, advising him to stay quiet. He turned it off, burying his face in the pillow as tears finally came. Saving someone should have been a good thing. Instead, it had erased his life. High above the city, Victoria Langford woke with a gasp, clutching her chest. The nightmare had returned, darkness closing in, breath slipping away until a man's voice cut through, urging her to breathe. She couldn't see his face, couldn't remember his name, only the pull of it lingering when she woke. Sitting alone in her penthouse kitchen, she scrolled through her emails, unsettled by what was missing. No one had told her who saved her. The doctors had been clear. Without immediate CPR, she wouldn't have survived. Someone had kept her alive until help arrived. Yet every answer she'd received from her executives had been evasive. Her unease hardened into resolve. She called security and demanded the footage. When the video arrived, she watched in silence. She saw herself fall, saw the room hesitate, and then saw a man in a gray uniform rush in without pause. She watched him fight for her life while others shouted and struck him. She watched Oliver Grant drag him away. By the time the video ended, Victoria's hands were shaking, not with weakness, but with fury. She made one call, her voice cold and precise. "Find Samuel Reed. I want everything." 3 days passed with a dull sameness that pressed down on Samuel like a weight he couldn't shake. Morning light crept through the thin curtains of his apartment, illuminating dust in the air and the stack of unpaid bills on the counter. He circled job listings in the newspaper with a dying pen, the ink scratching faintly against the page as if it shared his exhaustion. By afternoon, he was out on the streets, walking into diners, laundromats, and cleaning services, offering his labor with a polite smile that felt more like an apology. Each place met him with the same look: hesitation, followed by a quiet refusal that cut deeper than outright rejection. By the fourth morning, whispers followed him. At the corner laundromat, a woman folding clothes glanced up, recognition flickering across her face before she looked away. When Samuel met her eyes, she murmured something about the building downtown and trailed off. He finished her sentence for her, voice calm but tired, acknowledging what everyone seemed to think they knew. The woman flushed, muttering that people were saying things online, ugly things. Samuel didn't ask for details. He already knew how the story had been reshaped, how the truth had been bent until it fit a narrative people were eager to believe. Back home, the apartment felt smaller each day. Mrs. Carter sat by the window with the newspaper, shaking her head at another headline about rising costs and shrinking compassion. Lily padded into the kitchen, hair sticking up, asking if her father was going to work. Samuel knelt to her level and told her he was taking a break, forcing cheer into his voice. When she asked why people were being mean to him, he brushed her hair back gently and told her that fear made people cruel, but that it wouldn't last forever. He hoped she couldn't hear the doubt beneath his words. That afternoon, he visited a small cleaning company a few blocks away. The owner skimmed Samuel's application, then paused when he saw the name of his former employer. His tone shifted, cautious and guarded, explaining that controversy wasn't good for business. Samuel tried to argue that saving a life shouldn't count as trouble, but the man only shook his head, already reaching for the next file. Outside, the wind cut through Samuel's coat as laughter erupted behind him. A group of teenagers stood by the convenience store, phones glowing as one of them loudly repeated a rumor pulled straight from a headline. Samuel kept walking, eyes burning, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. That night, Mrs. Carter received a call from Samuel's sister. Her voice tense as she explained that people at church had been talking, sharing videos and speculation. Samuel closed his eyes, feeling the walls close in. He shut off his phone entirely, the silence afterward ringing louder than any insult. Lying beside Lily, he stared at the ceiling, his back still aching from the blows he'd taken. He wondered how he was supposed to teach his daughter about doing the right thing when the world seemed determined to punish it. Across the city, Victoria sat alone in her penthouse, the image from the surveillance footage looping in her mind. She had replayed it more times than she could count, studying Samuel's face, the strain in his jaw, the way he shielded her body even as hands dragged him away. Guilt settled heavy in her chest. She had built her empire on efficiency and delegation, trusting systems to handle problems she didn't have time to see. Now she understood what that blindness had cost. She didn't summon a driver. She pulled on jeans and a sweater, grabbed her keys, and drove herself west. The city changed as she went, glass towers giving way to cracked sidewalks and aging brick buildings. When she found the address, her stomach tightened. The building looked tired, paint peeling, stairs sagging under years of neglect. She knocked, the cold air biting at her neck. Lily opened the door, her eyes widening as she recognized the woman from the billboards. Victoria softened her voice, asking for Samuel. Lily hesitated, then admitted he was sick, that he hadn't been eating, that he kept saying he was tired. Victoria's throat closed as she stepped inside. The apartment was dim and cold, the heater rattling uselessly. Samuel lay curled on a thin mattress, blankets pulled tight around his gaunt frame, his breathing shallow and uneven. Victoria dropped to her knees beside him, calling his name. His skin was hot beneath her fingers. She shouted for an ambulance, her voice sharp with urgency. Lily clutched her stuffed rabbit in the corner, frozen with fear. Victoria squeezed to Samuel's hand, telling him he'd saved her life, that it was her turn now. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder until paramedics burst through the door and lifted him onto a stretcher. She climbed into the ambulance without hesitation, ignoring the stares of neighbors peering from doorways. Inside, monitors beeped as paramedics worked quickly, murmuring about dehydration and systemic stress. Victoria watched Samuel's face, pale and drawn, and felt a fierce determination settle in her chest. When one paramedic recognized her, his expression shifted from surprise to respect. No one said it aloud, that they both knew why she was there at the private medical center. Doctors took over, moving Samuel through bright corridors and behind swinging doors. Victoria paced the waiting room, the soft music and plush chairs feeling surreal against the knot of fear in her stomach. She made a call to her legal assistant, canceling meetings and arranging for Lily to be brought in safely. When the girl arrived, wrapped in an oversized coat, Victoria knelt to reassure her, promising that her father was strong and being taken care of. Hours later, a nurse led them into Samuel's room. Tubes and monitors surrounded him, but his breathing was steadier, his color improved. The doctor explained that exhaustion and stress had pushed his body to the brink, but that he would recover. Victoria exhaled, tension easing for the first time since she'd seen the footage. Lily placed her stuffed rabbit on Samuel's chest and whispered that she'd taken care of him. As night deepened, Lily fell asleep in a chair, curled under a blanket. Victoria remained by the bed, watching Samuel's chest rise and fall. She thought about the boardroom, about the way no one had stepped forward until he did. She realized that his act hadn't just saved her life. It had exposed the cracks in everything she'd built. When Samuel stirred and opened his eyes, confusion flickered across his face. She told him where he was, why she was there. When he asked why she cared, she answered honestly, explaining that she'd seen the truth at last. Tears filled his eyes as he admitted they'd accused him of assault, that no one believed him. Victoria apologized, her voice steady but thick with emotion, promising it wouldn't end that way. Samuel spoke quietly, asking not just for help, but for a chance to be seen, for a world where his daughter wouldn't learn that doing right meant losing everything. Victoria nodded, a vow forming in her heart. By morning, sunlight filtered through the hospital curtains. Samuel slept peacefully, Lily breathing softly nearby. Victoria stepped into the hallway and made a series of calls, arranging temporary housing, medical care, and support without fanfare. She returned to the room with a document in hand, clearing Samuel's name, and an offer that would change the course of both their lives. When she left him to rest, she knew this was only the beginning, that the reckoning she'd set in motion would ripple far beyond that hospital room. 2 days later, Samuel crossed the threshold of a place that didn't feel real the moment he stepped inside. His legs were still weak from the hospital, his body slow and sore, but he stood frozen in the center of the living room, as if afraid the space might vanish if he moved too quickly. Warm light spilled in through wide windows, bouncing softly off clean walls and a polished wooden floor. There was no peeling paint, no flickering bulb humming overhead, no stale smell of damp carpet. Instead, the air carried a faint scent of citrus and something new, something hopeful. Lily darted past him with a burst of laughter, her small shoes thudding against the floor as she explored. She opened cabinets, peeked into drawers, and announced every discovery like a miracle. There was cereal in the pantry. There were clean dishes already stacked in the cupboards. There was a bedroom with dinosaur sheets waiting just for her. Samuel blinked hard, emotion rising too fast, too sharp, forcing him to grip the back of a chair until the room steadied again. Mrs. Carter shuffled in behind them, leaning on a new walker, her eyes widening as she took in the space. She muttered a quiet prayer under her breath, then let out a disbelieving laugh. She had lived long enough to know that life rarely handed out kindness without strings attached, and yet here it was, undeniable. Samuel closed the door gently behind them, the click sounding final, like the end of a chapter he hadn't known how to finish. On the kitchen counter sat a small welcome basket with his name written neatly on a card. Fresh bread, fruit, and a folded note rested beside a simple vase of white flowers. Samuel picked up the card with careful fingers and read the short message inside. It didn't talk about charity or favors owed. It spoke only of rest, of safety, of breathing again. He pressed it briefly to his chest before setting it down, as if anchoring himself to the moment in the days that followed. He felt Victoria Langford's presence everywhere without seeing her once. Medical appointments were scheduled without him asking. Mrs. Carter received care she had postponed for years. Lily was enrolled in counseling with a therapist who spoke gently and listened more than she talked. And sitting unopened in Samuel's email inbox was the job offer. Waiting patiently, never pushed, never framed as a dead dot at night. After Lily fell asleep in her new bed and the apartment settled into a comfortable quiet, Samuel stood on the small balcony overlooking the city. The skyline glowed in the distance, close enough to remind him of where he'd been broken, far enough to suggest he didn't have to live there forever. His phone buzzed with a message from Victoria, inviting him to visit the office space, no expectations attached. He stared at the words for a long time before replying that he would come, one step at a time. The following Monday, he stood outside the glass-fronted annex of Langford Enterprises, adjusting his scarf as rain-darkened sidewalks reflected the morning light. Walking through the doors felt nothing like the last time he'd entered one of her buildings. No one stopped him. The security guard nodded politely. The receptionist smiled and welcomed him by name. Small gestures, but they landed heavier than any grand apology. The elevator carried him up to an open floor, flooded with sunlight. Victoria stood near the window, coffee in hand, watching the river below. She turned as he approached, a faint smile touching her face. Samuel admitted he'd nearly turned back twice before leaving home. She told him she was glad he hadn't. They walked the empty space together, the quiet filled with possibility rather than judgment. She explained a vision for the role, not as a corporate initiative, but as a correction. An employee welfare department shaped by someone who understood invisibility, someone who knew what it meant to be essential and ignored at the same time. Samuel listened, overwhelmed and cautious, his instincts warning him about stepping into rooms where power had always lived without him. When she asked if he was interested, he didn't answer right away. They sat at a table with nothing but a sketchpad between them. Samuel spoke slowly at first, then with growing certainty. He talked about real light in break rooms, about childcare support that wasn't performative, about emergency funds that meant rent paid on time instead of eviction notices taped to doors. Victoria wrote everything down, never interrupting, never dismissing an idea. By the time an hour passed, the pages were full, and Samuel realized his hands were no longer shaking. He agreed to take the role, not because of the title, but because of the chance to build something that could protect people like him. Victoria accepted with a nod that felt more like gratitude than victory. As he left, she thanked him not for saving her life, but for trusting her with his future. The announcement came quietly at first, then all at once. Press releases named Samuel Reed as Director of Employee Welfare Initiatives. Internal emails outlined the program's goals. And somewhere in a dim office across the city, Oliver Grant read the news with a tightening jaw and a glass of untouched bourbon in his hand. To him, Samuel was never meant to sit at a table, much less reshape one. The idea that the janitor he'd ordered out of a boardroom now held influence made his stomach churn. Within days, information began to surface online. Old eviction records, medical bills, a sealed juvenile offense dragged into the light and stripped of context. The pattern was unmistakable. Samuel felt it before anyone said a word, a familiar pressure settling in his chest. When Victoria's legal assistant called to warn him of the smear campaign, He wasn't surprised. He named Oliver without hesitation. Instead of retreating, Samuel asked for a meeting. Not with executives, but with staff. The room filled quickly, a mix of faces he recognized and others he didn't. People who cleaned, cooked, guarded doors, and answered phones. He stood in front of them without slides or prepared remarks. His voice steady despite the weight pressing down on him. He told them the truth before it could be twisted further. He spoke about his past plainly, without apology. He explained why none of it disqualified him from believing in fairness. He talked about systems that punished survival and called it morality. And he promised that the department they were building would not exist to look good, but to do good, even when it was uncomfortable. Silence followed, thick and uncertain. Then someone clapped. Another joined. Soon the room filled with sound, not polite applause, but something deeper, like recognition finding its voice. Samuel stepped down from the front feeling lighter than he had in months. Across town, Victoria watched the fallout unfold and acted decisively. Oliver Grant's authority began to unravel under scrutiny, his quiet maneuvers exposed one by one. The message was clear and public. Targeting Samuel Reed meant challenging the values she was now willing to defend openly. That evening, Samuel returned home, exhausted but steady. Lily ran to him, chattering about her day, and Mrs. Carter greeted him with a knowing smile. As the city settled into night, Samuel stood once more on the balcony, looking out at the lights. The storm hadn't passed. Not completely. But for the first time, he wasn't facing it alone, and that made all the difference. 6 months moved like a slow tide, steady and impossible to ignore. What began as a single office and a handful of handwritten notes grew into something tangible, something that shifted the atmosphere inside Langford Enterprises in ways no glossy memo ever had. Samuel's days filled with meetings that didn't feel like interrogations. Conversations where people spoke honestly instead of cautiously. He listened more than he talked, learning names, stories, and patterns that repeated themselves across departments. Every complaint, every quiet confession felt like proof that the system he was helping to build had been needed. Long before his own fall made it visible, the welfare initiative launched without fanfare. No champagne toast or grand speech from the executive floor. Instead, it opened its doors quietly, offering resources that spoke for themselves. Emergency housing assistance was approved within days instead of months. Childcare stipends appeared in paychecks without employees having to beg. Counseling sessions were scheduled during paid hours, not squeezed into exhausted evenings. The response was immediate. People who had learned to keep their heads down started lifting them, testing whether this new structure would really hold. Samuel felt the pressure of it constantly. Each decision carried weight, not because of shareholders or optics, but because real lives were balanced on the outcomes. He stayed late often, the office lights dimmed except for his own, reviewing cases until the words blurred. Some nights, he sat alone and wondered how a man who once pushed a mop down silent hallways now held responsibility that could change the direction of hundreds of families. The doubt never fully left him, but it no longer froze him in place. At home, life settled into a rhythm that still felt fragile but real. Lily adjusted quickly, her laughter returning in full, unguarded bursts. She talked about school friends and drawings taped to classroom walls. Mrs. Carter grew stronger with physical therapy, her sharp humor resurfacing alongside her strength. Samuel watched them both carefully, measuring his choices against the peace he was finally able to give them. He knew how easily it could all be taken away again. The rumors never fully disappeared. Anonymous comments still surfaced online, dragging up old records as if repetition might make them truer. But something had changed. Each attempt to discredit Samuel was met with swift public correction from the company. Legal statements replaced silence. Facts replaced implication. Victoria refused to let the narrative be controlled by those who thrived in shadows. She had learned the cost of quiet complicity, and she paid close attention now. Oliver Grant watched it all with growing desperation. His influence shrank as audits peeled back layers of carefully buried decisions. What he had once dismissed as routine risk management now looked disturbingly like systematic erasure. When his badge was finally revoked, it happened without drama. A brief internal notice, followed by his quiet exit from the building he'd once ruled. There was no satisfaction in it for Samuel, only a sober understanding of how easily power corrupted when left unchecked. The first National Labor Justice Conference invitation arrived unexpectedly. Samuel read the email twice before believing it was real. He almost declined, the instinct to stay small tugging at him hard. Victoria encouraged him without pressure, reminding him that visibility was no longer something to fear, but a tool he could use. He spent nights preparing, rewriting his speech until it sounded less like a defense and more like a declaration, standing on the stage months later. The lights warm against his face, Samuel felt the familiar flutter of nerves. He looked out at the audience and saw a sea of strangers, all waiting. He didn't speak as a hero or an expert. He spoke as himself. He talked about being overlooked, about the quiet dignity of people who keep systems running without recognition. He admitted his flaws, his past, and the fear that still visited him on bad days. When he finished, the applause felt less like praise and more like understanding. Lily waited until the last word left his mouth before racing up the aisle, wrapping her arms around him with the fierce pride only a child could carry so purely. Samuel laughed, the sound breaking through the tension he hadn't realized he was holding. In that moment, he understood that this wasn't about redemption or recognition. It was about refusing to disappear when the world expected him to. Victoria watched from the back of the room, content to remain unseen. She listened as people approached Samuel afterward, thanking him for putting words to experiences they'd never been able to explain. She felt the weight of what she had nearly lost and what she had chosen to protect. Her company was changing, not because of a policy shift, but because she had finally allowed humanity to disrupt efficiency. That evening, Samuel returned to the balcony of their apartment, the city lights stretching out beneath him like a living map. Lily sat beside him, wrapped in a blanket, her head resting against his arm. She asked him if he was happy now, the question simple and earnest. Samuel didn't answer right away. He thought about the pain, the anger, the nights he believed he was finished. Then he thought about the morning light through hospital curtains, about a door opened instead of closed. He told her yes, finally, not because everything was perfect, but because he no longer felt invisible. He held her a little tighter as the city breathed around them, knowing that the journey ahead would still demand courage. But this time, he would meet it standing tall, using the space he had earned to make sure others were seen too. The months that followed carried a quieter kind of momentum, the sort that didn't announce itself with headlines but reshaped lives in steady, undeniable ways. Samuel found that his work no longer felt like a reaction to injustice, but a forward motion towards something better. The welfare program expanded beyond Langford Enterprises, not because of ambition, but because other companies began asking uncomfortable questions of themselves. They wanted to know how one janitor's story had forced a corporation to look in the mirror, and whether that reckoning could be replicated elsewhere. Samuel traveled more than he ever had before, sitting in conference rooms that once would have intimidated him beyond words. Now, he spoke calmly, not as a savior, but as proof that listening could be a form of leadership. He described systems that didn't assume failure, but prepared for reality. He talked about how dignity was not an incentive, but a baseline. Each conversation chipped away at the old belief that compassion weakened profit, replacing it with evidence that loyalty, safety, and fairness strengthened everything they touched. At home, life continued to soften around the edges. Lily grew taller, her laughter louder, her questions sharper. She asked about fairness and why some people had more than others. Questions Samuel answered honestly, never pretending the world was gentler than it was. Mrs. Carter regained enough strength to volunteer at the local community center, her sharp observations now paired with a renewed sense of purpose. Their apartment filled with small signs of stability plants on the windowsill, photos on the walls, routines that no longer felt temporary. The past still surfaced from time to time, like a scar aching before rain. Occasionally, someone would recognize Samuel in public and whisper his name, their tone uncertain, caught between apology and curiosity. He met those moments with calm, no longer feeling the need to explain himself. The truth had a way of settling when it was no longer chased. He had learned that vindication didn't come from silencing critics, but from building something that outlasted them. Victoria Langford watched the transformation with a mix of pride and humility. Her role had shifted as well, not in title, but in posture. She spent more time listening than directing, asking questions she once would have delegated. The company's culture reflected that change. Meetings included voices that had never been invited before. Decisions slowed just enough to consider impact alongside outcome. It wasn't perfect, and Victoria no longer pretended it needed to be the manner. One afternoon, she invited Samuel to her office, not for business, but for reflection. They sat across from each other, the city stretching out behind them through glass that once symbolized separation. Victoria admitted that the moment she'd collapsed on the boardroom floor, had not just stopped her heart, but fractured her certainty. Samuel listened without judgment, understanding that accountability, when sincere, was not a performance, but a process. She thanked him again, not for saving her life, but for refusing to disappear afterward. Samuel responded with quiet honesty, telling her that courage hadn't felt noble in the moment, only necessary. They shared a rare silence, one built not on power, but on mutual recognition of how close both of them had come to losing something irreplaceable. The anniversary of the incident arrived without ceremony. Samuel spent the day as he always did now, reviewing cases, approving assistance, and checking in with teams. That evening, he returned home to find Lily and Mrs. Carter waiting with a light, simple cake, unevenly frosted and clearly made with more enthusiasm than skill. They sang loudly, laughing when the tune fell apart. Samuel made a wish he didn't say out loud, one rooted not in gratitude for survival, but in hope for sustainability. Later that night, after the dishes were washed and the apartment settled into quiet, Samuel stood alone on the balcony once more. The city lights felt familiar now, no longer distant or threatening. He thought about the man he had been the night he'd ridden the bus home, hunched and hollow, believing his life had ended in that boardroom. He thought about how close he had come to letting the world's judgment define him completely. He realized then that the most profound change hadn't been the job, the recognition, or even the justice. It was the internal shift from invisibility to presence. He no longer measured his worth by how unnoticed he could remain. He had learned to take up space without apology, to speak without shrinking, and to stand without waiting for permission. A message buzzed on his phone, an update from a partner company implementing the welfare model he'd helped design. Another workplace was changing, another group of employees gaining access to resources that acknowledged their humanity. Samuel smiled, not with pride, but with a quiet sense of continuity. This was how change endured, not through spectacle, but through repetition. Inside, Lily stirred in her sleep, murmuring something about school and drawings. Samuel went in to check on her, adjusting the blanket around her shoulders. He watched her breathe, steady and untroubled, and felt the weight of responsibility settle gently instead of crushing him. This was what he had fought for, not recognition, but a future where his daughter wouldn't have to prove her worth to deserve safety. The next morning, Samuel stood before a new group of employees at a company just beginning its own reckoning. He told his story once again, not as a warning, but as an invitation. He spoke about a moment when doing the right thing cost him everything, and how refusing to let that loss define him became the foundation for something larger. He reminded them that systems were built by people, and people could choose differently. As the room filled with thoughtful silence, Samuel felt the familiar steadiness in his chest. He no longer feared being seen, because he understood now that visibility, when paired with integrity, was not a threat but a responsibility. He carried that knowledge with him as he stepped down, ready to listen as much as he spoke. Far above the city streets, life moved forward in countless unseen ways, shaped by small acts of courage that rarely made headlines. Samuel Reed had once been invisible, his presence dismissed until it became unavoidable. Now, he moved through the world with intention, using the space he had earned to widen the path for others. And in the quiet moments, when the city lights flickered and the day's noise faded, Samuel allowed himself to feel something he once thought impossible. Not triumph, not relief, but a grounded, enduring sense of belonging. He was no longer defined by a single moment of crisis, but by what he chose to build in its aftermath.